Chapter 3. My family background is somewhat unusual compared to the average deaf person. According to most sources, about 90% of deaf people have hearing parents. The 10% of deaf people who have deaf parents are often considered the lucky ones. While a great number of deaf children with hearing parents fall behind in terms of linguistic development because they cannot hear the spoken language of their parents, deaf children of deaf parents experience no such communication gap. Their language, American Sign Language, is visual instead of oral, but a language nonetheless. This crucial access to language allows normal linguistic and cognitive development to take place, with the many language experiences that arise naturally amongst parents and children who can communicate effectively. And then there are the social advantages, such as never being left out of conversations and enjoying all the kinds of family outings. Deaf children of deaf parents usually have access to everything going on around them. There is no wondering what everyone said, none of that painful, never mind, it wasn't important, brushes it off, that are all too common with hearing relatives and friends who don't sign. In deaf families, the information is right there in ASL for deaf children to enjoy and assimilate. All in all, deaf children of deaf parents are considered lucky because they have a strong linguistic background, including a better grasp of both ASL and English. They live in a more sociably favorable home environment. They're also held in high esteem by the deaf community in general and tend to have strong leadership qualities that help them gain power and prestige. The skill they pick up while immersed in the deaf world are often skills that they can carry over and utilize in the hearing world. So in my case, what happened? My family experience has been anything but what you'd expect from a deaf child of deaf parents. People today still see me signing and assume I'm hearing, hard of hearing, or a hearing-minded deaf guy. Often, their jaws drop when they find out I come from a deaf family, and they scratch their heads even more when I try to explain the dynamics of my family's background. No matter what I say, the question always remains, how could a deaf child be surrounded by so much deafness in his family and not internalize it as part of his own identity? It's a good question that takes quite an effort to answer. To many deaf people, having deaf parents is a badge of honor. I understand why this is so, and of course I'm proud of my folks. But while I was growing up, I never had a clue that this was such a big deal. After all, hearing family members were acting on the doctor's advice to fix and therefore deny my deafness. This convinced me that deafness was something to be ashamed of, not proud of. On top of that, my mother's closest friends in the deaf community also happened to have deaf children. This led me to the erroneous conclusion that it was mostly deaf people who had deaf kids. I always had the impression we were a tiny, secluded, and flawed population. I personally thought we were a freak show. Being admonished for signing only made it worse. It led me to believe we'd be ridiculed in public if we ever openly displayed our deafness. Yes, I was actually ashamed of who I was. In the meantime, I didn't know that there were millions of deaf and hard of hearing people all over the world. I didn't know that a great number of them were proud to be deaf, and I had no idea that most of them would love to have deaf parents as I did. I never really appreciated how lucky I was to have deaf parents who understood my struggles until I was college age, when deaf friends of mine made a big fuss over it. And when people try to figure out how a deaf child of deaf parents can go 20 plus years with minimal use of sign language, they look at my family background for answers and find even more questions. Further adding to the confusion is the fact that I have plenty of other deaf relatives besides my mother and father. Whereas my mother is the only deaf person on her side of the family, my father's side is predominantly deaf. My father's late parents, Claude Drosba and Margie Schooley Drosba, were deaf. Claude came from a hearing family, but Margie's family has a long history of deafness. There are several deaf aunts, uncles, and cousins from the Schooley family whom I've been in touch with from time to time. In fact, there was sort of an odd family reunion when I later attended Gallaudet University. My two distant cousins, Trina Schooley and Dan Rothling, were also enrolled at Gallaudet, and none of us really knew each other until then. Imagine bumping into two people in a big university, getting a good conversation going, and then realizing, hey, we're family. Weird, yes, but it gives you an idea of how large my father's family is. And while my mother's hearing family was close-knit and living in Philadelphia, my father's was spread out all over Pennsylvania. Many are in Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, and Wauneta County, most of whom I have yet to meet. My parental grandparents, Margie and Clyde, had lived in Philadelphia for a considerable time, but had moved back to Scranton when I was 6 or 7 years old. Margie would again relocate to Philadelphia when I was about 13. But then Claude had died and Margie wound up marrying Michael Novick, also deaf. It must be noted that my content with the deaf side of my family, due to geographic factors, ranged from occasional to sporadic. We usually got together during Christmas, Easter, and someone's birthday. The deaf family members I saw most frequently were my grandmother Margie, who we affectionately called Nana, my step-grandfather Mike, and my Uncle Bob and Aunt Libby. There are a variety of reasons why my exposure to deaf family members didn't result in my becoming a native ASL signer. First of all, during the early years of my life, I was hearing or pretty close to hearing. I did not have an urgent need to pick up sign language. I could understand my parents signing, but I hardly signed much myself. When I did sign, it was mostly basic signs mixed up with home signs that were just enough to get the message through. Also, not all of the deaf people in my family are very fluent in ASL. Most of them use local and home signs that were not prevalent in mainstream deaf society. A number of them had attended oral schools where sign language was not permitted. So they too were late in picking up sign language, and thus there were not native signers. Some of my relatives were hearing or hard of hearing at an early age before later going deaf, such as my father and Uncle Bob. I followed this pattern myself. They often use a combination of signing and voice depending on who they were interacting with. Most of my recollections of family get-togethers evoke memories of a communication style closer to what is known as SIMCOM, simultaneously communication, utilizing both voice and sign. My mother and Aunt Libby, both prelingually deaf, are the exceptions and have always used ASL. And I do recall other family members signing more fluently while in deaf clubs or other situations where most everyone else was deaf. But as wonderful and unique as my father's family may have been, I only saw them occasionally. It was my mother's hearing family where I spent a much greater amount of time. And when my hearing loss was first discovered, they were absolutely devastated. By contrast, my father's family just shrugged, and life went on. It was no big deal to them. As previously mentioned, my mother's family searched for professional advice that turned out to be anything but. They wound up following doctor's orders and discouraged me from signing. Somehow, they got my parents to go along with this. The message was clear to me, and I internalized it. Deafness and ASL are bad, bad, bad. Another explanation for my initially poor signing skills can be found by taking a closer look at my peers. Virtually all of them were hearing. The neighborhood kids I played with were hearing, and so were my classmates at school. When my parents visited Uncle Bob and Aunt Libby, I would play with their hearing daughters, Mary and Nora. Anyone who knew anything about sociology will tell you that we learn most from our peers, so perhaps this is yet another reason why I didn't sign that much at an early age. Monkey see, monkey do. All of my peers were using voice, so I did the same. Since I was postlingually deaf and still had enough residual hearing to be able to talk, I did. To me, being surrounded by hearing peers meant I had to be like them. I managed to do reasonably well most of the time. Later on, I would inevitably stumble. Although I was often on the hearing side of the fence, it's not like I was completely shut off from the deaf world. How could I be? After all, I was born into it. No matter how much pressure there was to adapt to the hearing world, my parents were still a part of the deaf culture. Besides my deaf family, I got to see other deaf people when my parents took me with them to their local deaf clubs. I saw many deaf adults, but perhaps I was not deaf enough myself to relate to them. I did, however, get a good taste of what the deaf world was like. Back in those days, TTYs had just gone on the market. They were noisy, oversized machines that were no substitute for face-to-face conversations. Many deaf people and had yet to get a TTY around that time. I was a kid, so they often went to local deaf clubs on a weekly or monthly basis. This resulted in a phenomenon that I called the infamous deaf chat syndrome. It was not uncommon to stay until the wee hours of the morning, as each gathering was an opportunity to catch up on a month's worth of news. Likewise, when deaf friends visited each other, the visits were often unannounced and would last for hours. My mother would take me on such visits. Usually, we visited her good friend Carol. Often, I would watch my mother in amazement. Doesn't she ever run out of things to say? Apparently not. Although I enjoyed playing with Carol's children, by 10 p.m., I'd had enough, and then the whining would start. "Can we go home now?" My mother would say. "Yes, in just a few more minutes." Those minutes would turn into hours, and the whining would grow louder. "I want to go home now." At this juncture, my mother would tell me to go get my jacket. We were just about out of there. But I'd put on my jacket, my mother would finally head for the door and chat some more. I'd tug at her pants as she stood in the hallway chatting up a storm. For the umpteenth time, I would remind her it was time to go home. Finally, she would move to the doorway where she stopped in her tracks and continued yakking. It seemed that each conversational tidbit took a life of its own. Heaven forbid someone briefly mentioned something new on the way out, for a brand new conversation would be spawned right on the spot. For example, "Okay, I'll see you next week. Don't forget to tell Laura I said hello." "Oh, sure. I saw Laura last week. She's going to the shore with Ted." "What? She's seeing Ted now? Last time I saw her, blah, 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 blah. Ad infinitum, ad nauseam." Yes, it was annoying. But I didn't realize that this was the deaf way of catching up on conversation that couldn't happen anywhere else. Hearing people chat with each other all the time at work, in line at the grocery store, and so on. It doesn't work that way with deaf people. Although in today's modern era, emails and text messaging, not to mention video phones, have soothed our pent-up need to get out and talk to somebody. So when a group of deaf friends get together, you know they're going to yak for hours on end. All I can say about this experience is that I learned how to become a very patient kid, and that no conversation was over until my mother actually started the car and backed out of the driveway. I just chalked it up as something that went on in my mother's deaf world. For as much as I made fun of her for her unlimited chat potential, I would eventually discover that it was hereditary. Years later, I would succumb to deaf chat syndrome myself. I even wrote an article about it, ingeniously titled, "Help! I'm signing and I can't shut up." Maybe as an 8-year-old, I never knew it. But perhaps I was subconsciously taking notes and learning how to be culturally deaf. I was always fascinated with my parents' deaf friends, the deaf clubs that they went to, and their wholesome sense of humor. But as a youngster, somehow, I was still on the outside looking in.